In a bustling city, a wealthy boy grows up surrounded by luxury, never learning the true value of things. But everything begins to crumble when his own arrogance leads him to humiliate his mother in public over money. Destiny shifts when a simple backpack, rejected by him, reveals an unexpected truth in the hands of another boy. And it is in this unlikely encounter that a powerful lesson of humility, character, and transformation begins to change everything forever. Fifth Avenue never slept, even in the early hours of the morning, when the sun was still crawling behind the skyscrapers and the damp autumn mist of New York wrapped around the buildings like a gray veil. There was always someone running, always a car honking, always a story unfolding between the wide sidewalks and the neon signs that flashed indifferent to time. It was in this city that the Miller family lived, inside an apartment on the 18th floor of an imposing building on the Upper East Side, where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a Manhattan so vast it seemed to belong to them. Sarah Miller woke up at 6:30 on a Thursday morning to the muffled sound of the alarm and the certainty that the day would be long. She lay there for a few moments, staring at the white ceiling, listening to the false silence of the apartment, the kind of silence belonging to those who live in a place too expensive to let the noise in. She was 42 years old, with brown hair that reached almost to her shoulders, almond-shaped eyes that carried a fatigue that wasn't just physical, and a discreet beauty that the weight of the last few months had made even more restrained. She got up slowly, passed through the master suite without making a sound, and went to the kitchen to prepare coffee. Mark had left earlier, as always. Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Developments, one of the largest construction firms in the state of New York. He had meetings that began before 8 and ended after 8 at night. The company belonged to Robert Sterling, a man whose name appeared in business magazines alongside figures Sarah could barely imagine, written out in full. Mark had worked for this man for 11 years, and in that time, he had built a solid reputation, a prestigious position, and a salary that allowed the Miller family to live with a comfort few would dare call simple. The apartment, the imported car in the garage, the trips during school breaks, the private gym, the bilingual prep school in Brooklyn Heights. All of this was the result of years of Mark's dedication to a company that wasn't his, but which he served with the loyalty of someone who believes that one day the effort will be rewarded even more greatly. Sarah filled her cup and stood before the kitchen window, observing the buildings in the distance. She had made a decision a little over 4 months ago that she was still trying to swallow. With a portion of the money she kept separate, a reserve she had taken years to accumulate on her own, she had decided to invest in a private equity fund that a friend from her Pilates group had recommended with such enthusiasm that it seemed impossible to doubt. The friend had data, spreadsheets, and success stories. And Sarah, who during that period felt invisible inside her home, invisible to Mark, who arrived late and left early, invisible to her son, who only saw her when he needed something, had decided that this would be the moment she did something for herself, something that proved she also knew how to make decisions. The result had not been what she expected. The fund suffered a significant drop in the first 2 months, and the money she had set aside shrank in a way that left her stomach turning for weeks. It hadn't been a catastrophic loss. Mark wouldn't even be able to tell the difference on the bank statement if she didn't tell him. But for Sarah, it had been much more than money. It had been a bet on herself that had gone wrong, and the feeling it left was one of silent humiliation that she carried in her chest like a weight she couldn't name. She had been managing the month's expenses more carefully since then. Small things she hadn't noticed before now passed under her gaze before going into the cart or the app. It wasn't a real necessity, she knew that. Mark's salary came in regularly and covered everything with plenty to spare. But in that gesture, there was an attempt to repair, on her own, what had gone out of place. The problem was Julian. Her son had turned 12 the previous month, and was, Sarah would admit only to herself in her most honest moments, a difficult child. Not in a clinical sense, not in the sense of something needing a diagnosis or specialized attention. Difficult in the simplest and most painful sense of the word. He had grown up believing the world existed to serve him, and no one had worked hard enough to undo that belief in time. Sarah knew part of that was her responsibility. She had given in more times than she should have. She had turned every tantrum into a negotiation that always ended with Julian coming out victorious. She had called his whims genius and what was actually a lack of boundaries, cultivated carefully over years, a strong personality. Julian woke up around 7:30, when the coffee was already cold and the morning was well underway. He would walk into the kitchen without saying good morning, open the refrigerator with the cabinet door still swinging, and evaluate the contents with that look of someone who expected something different and more interesting than what they had found the last time. He was a tall boy for his age, with dark, slightly curly hair inherited from his father, and dark brown eyes that could look kind when they wanted to, but most of the time carried a bored expression that bothered adults without him knowing it. On that Thursday morning, he had appeared in the kitchen at 7:44, wearing a designer hoodie that cost the equivalent of 2 tanks of gas, and was looking at the table with a face Sarah knew well. "We don't have that pomegranate juice I like," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah took a sip of her coffee. "It's out, Julian. There's orange juice and a banana smoothie I just made." He made a sound with his mouth that wasn't a word, but communicated everything a word could communicate in that situation, and then went to the pantry in search of something that would satisfy him more. Sarah watched him from behind and felt that familiar mixture of love and fatigue that had marked the last few years of her relationship with her son. A love that wasn't questionable, that was rooted too deep to be shaken by any daily frustration, and a fatigue that was also real, that had also settled deep, that woke up with her and went to sleep with her every night. The school was 20 minutes away by car when traffic was good, which in New York was a condition that depended on variables difficult to control. The driver who usually took Julian had asked for the week off due to a family emergency, and Sarah had decided not to call a rideshare, trying to save where possible. She would take her son herself in their car. But when they went down to the building's garage and she opened the silver Honda Civic, Julian stopped in the middle of the parking lot and crossed his arms. "Where's the Range Rover?" he asked. "The Range Rover is being serviced, Julian, you know that. Then call a bigger car. I'm not going in the Civic." Sarah put her bag on the passenger seat and turned to her son. "You're going to be late if you stay here arguing about this." The boy didn't move. He stood there with that stone expression she knew so well, which meant the argument had only just begun. New York was waking up outside, oblivious to all of it, with its engines and its hurries and its stories that didn't stop for anyone. And inside that grey-floored garage, under the cold light of fluorescent tubes, a mother and a son were locked in a standoff that was much bigger than a car. Sarah took a deep breath, got into the vehicle and waited. After 40 seconds that felt much longer than that, Julian threw his backpack onto the back seat with unnecessary violence and got in, slamming the door with a force that made the car shake. He said nothing during the first 10 minutes of the trip. He kept staring out the window with headphones covering his ears, and Sarah drove in silence through the city, waking up around them, carrying in her chest that feeling she still hadn't found the right words to describe. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something more like the awareness that something had grown crooked inside her home, and that part of the responsibility for it was hers, and that correcting it now would be harder than it would have been before. When they arrived in front of the school, Julian opened the door without saying goodbye. Sarah said, "Bye, honey." He had already turned his back. She sat there for a moment with the engine running, looking through the rear window as he disappeared among the other students, and then took one deep breath, put the car in gear, and returned to the flow of the city. She had bills to pay, phone calls to return, and a meeting in the early afternoon with the financial advisor who had managed the unsuccessful investment. Life continued, as always, at the exact speed of New York, which waited for no one. The meeting with the financial advisor lasted nearly 2 hours and left Sarah with a headache that started at the base of her neck and spread slowly to her temples. It hadn't been a pleasant conversation, but it had been necessary. The fund had dropped more than the initial projections predicted, and the possibility of recovery in the coming months was real but uncertain, the kind of answer a financial advisor gives when they don't want to say directly that the money might keep shrinking. Sarah had written everything down in a small notebook she carried in her purse, thanked him with a composure that cost her effort, and walked out onto the sidewalk of the office in Chelsea with the afternoon sun hitting her face, and the feeling that the weight on her shoulders had increased by several degrees. She had to pick up Julian from school at 4:30. The driver was still off, the big car was still in the shop, and the Civic was with her. But there was something she needed to resolve before picking up her son, a payment that needed to be made in person at a bank branch near the school, and the traffic at that hour was so congested that she had parked the car in a lot 2 blocks away and decided to walk to the bank. The air was fresh. There was an autumn breeze moving the leaves of the trees along the sidewalk, and Sarah thought the walk would do her good. When she reached the school, Julian was standing on the sidewalk with 2 classmates, looking at his phone. Seeing his mother arrive on foot, he made a face that she noticed even before she got close. "Where's the car?" he asked without a greeting. "It's in the parking lot around the corner. We're walking there. It's only 2 blocks. The 2 classmates were watching. Julian stayed put. "You're joking," he said. And there was a tone in his voice that wasn't a genuine question, but a performative incredulity, the kind used when one wants others to hear. Sarah lowered her voice slightly, instinctively. "Julian, it's 2 blocks. Let's go, it's getting late." He didn't move. He made a gesture with his hand toward the phone and told his classmates he was heading out, and they dispersed without much interest. And then the 2 of them were left there on the sidewalk, mother and son. And Sarah hoped it would end quickly. It didn't. The argument about the 2 blocks extended to the parking lot, continued while Sarah paid the machine with her card, and still hadn't ended when they got into the Civic and she drove out toward home. Julian wanted to stop at an ice cream shop on the way. He wanted a specific brand that was only in a specific place in the completely opposite direction of the apartment. And when Sarah said there wasn't time for that, he began an escalation she recognized as the first signs of a storm. The next day, the situation got more complicated. The Range Rover was still at the mechanic, the driver was still off, and Julian had an appointment with the orthodontist that had been scheduled for weeks at a clinic in the Flatiron district, which was on the other side of town from the school. Sarah had calculated that if she went by car, it would take an absurd amount of time in afternoon traffic, and she had thought of a solution that seemed reasonable to her, taking the subway with her son. The nearest station was a 15-minute walk, and from there they would reach the clinic with 1 transfer without depending on traffic. She had mentioned this to Julian during dinner the night before, while Mark was still at the office and the 2 of them ate in silence in front of the TV. Julian had looked at her as if she had suggested they bike across the country. "Subway?" He had repeated the word as if it were a strange object he had found on the ground and didn't know how to name. "Subway, Julian, it's fast, it's safe, we'll get there on time." He hadn't replied further that night, but Sarah had seen the expression on his face and knew it wasn't over. The following afternoon, when she picked up her son from school and they walked to the entrance of the subway station at Columbus Circle, the storm arrived in full force. Julian stopped in front of the turnstile as if there were an invisible wall in front of him and refused to go through. Not with words, not with an argument, but with his whole body stiffened, feet planted on the ground, arms crossed over his chest, chin lifted with that stubbornness Sarah knew all too well. "Mum, I'm not getting on that." His voice was too loud for the space. There were other people around, a line forming behind them, a man in a suit waiting to pass the turnstile, 2 teenagers with backpacks who looked away with the embarrassment of someone witnessing something they'd rather not have seen. Sarah lowered her voice. "Julian, please." "No, you know I don't take the subway. Call a cab or an Uber." She felt the heat rise up her neck. It wasn't anger yet. It was that foyer of anger that feels like shame, but is actually a mixture of shame and exhaustion. People were looking. A woman with a small child in her arms watched her with an expression Sarah couldn't quite classify as judgment or compassion. "We're going to miss the appointment," she said, trying to keep her voice firm without raising it. "Then cancel it and reschedule with a car. I'm not going into that thing." "Julian, it's the subway. Thousands of people take it every day. It's completely normal. Maybe for you. I don't need to take the subway." The words came out of him without ceremony, without awareness of the weight they carried, with the devastating naturalness of someone who has never had to think before speaking. Sarah closed her eyes for a second, just one, and in that second, she felt everything at once. The embarrassment of being stuck there with a growing line behind her, the awareness that people were listening, the memory of all the other times she had given in, and the exhaustion of 12 years of an upbringing that had reached this point without her being able to change the course. She opened her eyes. Julian was looking at her with that expression she had learned to recognize as the face he made when he was testing how far she would go. She went outside with him. She called an Uber. She paid the surge price that was nearly double the normal fare. She sat in the back seat next to her son, who spent the whole trip looking at his phone without saying a word, and she looked out the window at the city passing by with its buildings and its streets, and its thousands of stories happening in parallel, and thought that something was very wrong with the path that had brought them here. Not just with her son, with her too. In the way she had built that pattern, one choice at a time, one concession at a time, until it had become the normal architecture of their relationship. The appointment with the orthodontist was quick. Julian would need to wear braces for approximately 18 months, the doctor explained with all the patience in the world, and the boy listened without much interest, looking at the ceiling of the exam room as if he were counting the panels. Sarah signed the estimate, scheduled the follow-up, and said, "Thank you." Outside the clinic, Julian asked for a snack. There was a burger joint at the end of the block, one of those with a trendy name and a line out the door, and he was already pointing to it before Sarah had finished putting the receipt in her purse. "We had dinner before leaving, Julian. But I'm hungry. There will be dinner at home." "There's nothing I like at home." Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the burger joint, then at the watch on her wrist. She thought about the money that had gone out that day just on transportation, plus the braces estimate, plus the maintenance fee for the apartment, due the following week. She thought about the financial advisor and the notebook with notes, and the weight that had settled in her neck since the meeting the day before. "We're going home," she said. And this time, her voice came out different. Quieter, firmer, without the edge of desperation that usually appeared when she was trying to convince her son of something. It was a voice she barely recognized as her own. Julian looked at her with a surprise that lasted less than a second, replaced immediately by a closed expression. He got into the taxi she called without saying anything, and remained in silence the whole way back. Sarah kept looking out the window again, with the city passing by, with New York being New York the way it always was, noisy and indifferent and full of life in every corner. And she thought, with a clarity she hadn't expected to feel at that moment, that something had to change. She didn't know how yet. She didn't know when. But the certainty was there, quiet and insistent, like a seed that had finally found the right soil to begin to sprout. Julian's birthday had passed the previous month, but the official party had been postponed due to a trip of Mark's that had extended longer than expected because of a negotiation in Chicago that didn't resolve in the estimated time. It had been a combination of factors that resulted in a 12-year-old boy without a party on his date, which for any child would be a reasonable disappointment, but for Julian had been treated as an injustice of epic proportions. Sarah had promised to make it up when Mark returned, and Mark had returned the previous week with an expensive gift and a promise that they would do something special soon. The special had been left for that Saturday afternoon. Mark had tried to book a restaurant, but an urgent work call had kept him at the office until early afternoon, and when he finally said he was leaving soon, Sarah had looked at the clock and calculated that with Saturday traffic in New York, eating out would mean dinner at 10 at night. So she had made a decision. She would take Julian to the neighborhood bakery he liked so much, that large, well-lit bakery on Madison Avenue that sold cakes of all kinds, and there they would buy whatever cake he wanted to celebrate. Mark would meet them later for dinner. It seemed simple. The Sweet Horizon Bakery was one of those establishments that had been in New York for over 30 years and remained crowded even with the multiplication of modern coffee shops around it. It had marble floors, wide-lit displays that showcased products with an almost theatrical dignity, and a smell of butter and vanilla that attacked the emotional memory of anyone who entered. Sarah liked that place. She had taken Julian there since he was little, when he still called croissants curly bread, and ate half a donut before reaching the register. That afternoon, she had entered with her son, holding the caramel leather bag Mark had given her for her birthday 2 years ago, and had walked directly to the cake display. There was a generous variety: carrot cakes with chocolate frosting, layered strawberry cakes, passion fruit cakes with meringue, Belgian chocolate cakes that cost enough to pay the electricity bill of a small apartment. Sarah had looked at the price tags with a disguise she thought she was managing well and had begun to calculate internally. "I want that one," Julian said, pointing to a hazelnut cake with dark chocolate ganache frosting that sat on a separate glass pedestal from the others. It was evidently the most expensive in the display, and the tag confirmed it without ceremony. Sarah looked at the cake, then at the tag, then at her son. "How about the strawberry one? You've always liked the strawberry one." "I liked it when I was a kid," he replied with a tone that made it clear that Ira was left behind. "Now I want the hazelnut one." "That one is very big for us, Julian. It's just the two of us. So we eat a piece and take the rest home. I want that one." Sarah stood looking at the cake for a few moments. There were other customers around, families moving between tables and displays with that weekend casualness she wished she were feeling at that moment. An employee in a white apron waited on the inside of the counter with the patience of someone who had already seen many difficult decisions made in front of that display. She pointed to a chocolate cake with dulce de leche filling, which sat just below the hazelnut one and had a tag that made her more comfortable. "And this one? It has chocolate and dulce de leche. You love dulce de leche." Julian looked at the cake as if she were offering something profoundly inferior, the kind of look a person gives when they are being kind enough not to say out loud what they think. "It's not what I asked for," he said simply. The employee waited. Some people nearby began to pay attention, not overtly, but with that lateral attention people have when something in the scene around them clashes slightly with the normal rhythm. Sarah lowered her voice. "Julian, this one is within what I can spend today." Julian's voice did not lower with hers. On the contrary. "You're giving me a cheap cake on my birthday? Seriously, Mom? On my birthday?" The volume had drawn attention. Sarah felt the heat in her face before she felt anything else. "It's not cheap, Julian, it's different. And lower your voice, please. Why are you ashamed to tell the truth? You don't have the money to buy what I want, just say it." That was too much. Not the content of the sentence itself, which was a gross simplification of the situation, but the way it had been said, loudly, in a crowded place, with a tone of accusation that made the mother guilty of something the son barely understood. Sarah felt her eyes sting with an urge to cry that she refused with all the strength she had. She took a deep breath. She bought the chocolate cake with dulce de leche. She paid without looking at anyone. She took the box. She told her son they would go to one of the tables in the back. Julian went ahead with an anger he didn't even hide, pushing a chair with more force than necessary as he sat, face set, arms crossed, with no desire to disguise for the world around him how dissatisfied he was. Sarah placed the cake box on the table and stood for a moment, checking the contents of her bag by instinct, ensuring everything was there. There was in the bakery, sitting at a table near the window, a 23-year-old young woman named Chloe Vance. She worked as an administrative assistant at a physical therapy clinic nearby and had stopped at the bakery on her way home to have a coffee and read a paperback book she carried in her bag. It was her Saturday ritual, that interval between work and the bus she took in the late afternoon. She had black hair tied in a loose bun, a simple blue cotton blouse, and those large, attentive eyes that make some people look like they are always ready to notice something others missed. She had observed the scene between Sarah and Julian unintentionally, the same way one observes a storm through a window, with a mixture of discomfort and inevitability. She had felt a pang of empathy for the brown-haired woman who had bought the wrong cake, with the posture of someone trying not to crumble in public. It was then, in the middle of the discreet commotion Julian had created with the noise of the chair and the abrupt movement around the table, that something fell. Chloe saw it before anyone else. Sarah's bag had moved when she placed it on the back of the chair, and something had slid out and fallen to the floor silently, sliding under the neighboring table. It looked like an envelope, small, made of craft paper, the kind used to keep documents or money. Chloe stood up immediately, picked up the envelope before anyone stepped on it, and went to the table where the woman and the boy were sitting. "Excuse me, you dropped this." But Sarah had already gotten up to go get napkins at the counter, and Julian was facing away from the table looking at his phone. Neither of them had heard. Chloe stood for a moment with the envelope in her hand, looking at the woman walking toward the counter on the other side of the bakery, and took a step in her direction. But there was a line in front of the counter, and as she navigated the tables, another person crossed her path, and by the time she reached the other side, the brown-haired woman had already walked out the glass door of the bakery, with the boy in the grey hoodie beside her, the cake box in hand, both disappearing onto the busy sidewalk of Madison Avenue, before Chloe reached the door. She stood at the exit, looking at the sidewalk, with the envelope in her hand. She tried to spot the woman among the late afternoon passers-by, but New York swallowed people quickly. She was already gone. Chloe went back to her table, placed the envelope beside her coffee cup, and sat looking at it for a moment. It wasn't hers to open, she knew that. But she needed to find out who it belonged to, and for that, she would have to find the owner. She called over the employee in the white apron, who had served the woman at the cake display, and asked if she knew her name, or if the woman was a known customer of the bakery. The employee, a middle-aged woman named Beatrice, frowned in thought. "She comes here sometimes, but I don't know her name. I can ask management if she has a loyalty account." Chloe left her phone number with Beatrice and asked that if the woman returned or if they found any record, they should contact her. Then she carefully put the envelope in her bag, between the pages of the book she had stopped reading, and sat there for a few more minutes thinking about what had just happened, about how the world sometimes placed people inside stories they had no way of predicting when they woke up that morning, about how a young woman with a coffee and a book could suddenly find herself holding something belonging to a stranger who had left with a cake in her hand and a son beside her who seemed not to see anything beyond himself. Outside, New York continued. The cars on Madison Avenue, the trees with their thick trunks that didn't care about anything, the autumn wind sweeping leaves onto the sidewalks as if clearing the stage for what would come next. The call arrived on a Tuesday morning when Sarah was at the building's gym trying to convince her body to cooperate with 20 minutes on the treadmill. Her phone vibrated on the side tray of the machine, and she saw the financial advisor's name on the screen, Mark Henry with the office number in Chelsea. She slowed the treadmill, picked up the device with a still sweaty hand, and answered with that caution of someone who had learned that calls from financial advisors could be both good and bad, and that it was better not to create expectations before hearing what they had to say. "Sarah, how are you?" Mark Henry's voice had that slightly more animated tone that distinguished good calls from bad ones. "I need to give you an update on the fund." She turned off the treadmill completely. "Go ahead. So, the position you had there took a very significant turn in the last 2 weeks. The sector as a whole reacted better than the market projected, and the fund recovered not only what it had lost, but went beyond. You're looking at a very positive return over the original value. Significant." Sarah stood still in the middle of the empty gym, hand wrapped around the phone and breath still slightly accelerated from the treadmill, listening to Mark Henry explain the numbers with that financial market language she had learned to decode over the months. When he finished, she asked him to repeat the final value once, just to be sure she had understood correctly. He repeated it. She was silent for a few seconds. "Can you transfer it to my account?" she asked. "Whenever you want, I can do it today." "Then do it today." She hung up, stared at the phone in her hand, and then felt something loosen inside her chest. A knot that had settled months ago and suddenly slackened, not completely, but enough for her to breathe in a different way. It hadn't just been the money. It was the feeling that the decision she had made, that bet on herself that had gone crooked and made her feel foolish for weeks, had found a way back. She hadn't been wrong forever. She had only been wrong for a time. Mark still didn't know anything about the investment. She had kept it separate from the beginning, a project of hers, an account that didn't appear in the financial flow Mark monitored, and the idea had always been that when it worked out she would tell him, and when it went wrong she would resolve it alone. It had gone wrong first, and now it had worked out with plenty to spare. She would decide when and how to tell him, but before that, there was something she wanted to do. In the days following the call, Sarah kept thinking about what to do with that money. There was the obvious part: replenish the reserve, save what she had put in plus what it had earned, and continue as before. But there was also another idea that had entered her head in a way she couldn't expel. An idea that had started as an impulse and had transformed into something she felt made sense, that had a real intention behind it. She wanted to give something to Julian, not because he deserved it, not because he had behaved well or had done something that justified a gift, but because there was one last attempt there, one last bet, this time not on the financial market, but on her son. The idea was to give him a significant amount of money, enough for him to buy everything he had desired in recent months and see what he would do with it. See if generosity taught something that words had failed to. See if excess could finally reveal to the boy that things themselves were not the source of anything. She knew the idea had flaws. She knew there were educators who would say that was exactly the wrong path. But there was something in that plan that went beyond the logic of pedagogy. There was a maternal gesture of someone who still believed in her son, and that belief, as much as the last few months had tested it, was still there. The question was how to deliver it. It was a Thursday afternoon while organizing the storage room at the back of the apartment that Sarah found the backpack. It was an old backpack, dark grey canvas with faux leather details that had completely lost their shine, with two straps that were still intact, but with the fabric worn at the edges, and a main zipper that squeaked a bit when opened but worked. It had belonged to Mark in his first years at the company, before he swapped it for a leather briefcase that better matched the office standard. The backpack had stayed in the storage room ever since, unused, waiting for a function that had never appeared. Sarah held it by the straps for a moment, looking at it, and then the idea arrived complete, all at once, the way these ideas arrive when they've been ready for a long time and only wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. She would fill the backpack with the money, not with a transfer, not with a deposit, not with a gift card in an embroidered envelope, with folded bills, with the live and concrete paper that most people never see gathered in that way. The idea was that Julian would open the old backpack, which seemed to have no value at all, and discover that inside it there was a wealth he couldn't imagine. The metaphor was perhaps too obvious, but Sarah had reached a point where she preferred obvious to ineffective. She went to the bank on Friday morning, withdrew an amount that the teller processed without comment, but with a slightly raised eyebrow, and returned home with the money kept inside a discreet bag. She locked herself in her room, sat on the bed, and spent nearly an hour folding the bills carefully and placing them inside the backpack. Hundreds, 50s, folded in equal parts, distributed through the main compartment with an organization that satisfied her sense of order. When she finished, the compartment was full as far as it was possible to close the zipper without forcing it. She closed the backpack, placed it on the chair in the room, and sat looking at it for a long time. There was something there that was both simple and enormous. An old grey canvas backpack that on the outside said nothing, and on the inside carried more than most people saw in months of work. She imagined Julian's expression upon opening it. She imagined his eyes wide, the incredulity, perhaps the first sincere smile she had missed seeing for so long. Mark arrived home that night earlier than usual, around 8, which was a rarity. Sarah had prepared a simple dinner, pasta with fresh tomato sauce she had learned from her mother, and that Mark liked very much. The three of them ate together for the first time in several days, with the television off at Sarah's insistence, and the dinner was the kind of peaceful meal the family had stopped having frequently, but which, when it happened, made it seem like things weren't as distant as they seemed the rest of the time. Julian was quieter than usual. He had had a math test that day that hadn't gone well, and although he didn't admit it explicitly, there was in his short answers and the way he toyed with the pasta on his plate a sign that something was bothering him. Sarah noticed. Mark noticed too, asking with the caution of a father who knows there are moments when asking closes the door instead of opening it, and Julian said he was fine, just tired. After dinner, when Julian had gone to his room and Mark was watching the news in the living room, Sarah took the backpack from the bedroom and placed it near the living room door, in a place where it would be found the next day, like a casual surprise she would deliver in the morning. She had thought about making an event of it, sitting her son down for a conversation, contextualizing the gesture with words, but then she had given up on that idea. The gesture should speak for itself. The old backpack full of money was the message. Any explanation she added beforehand would run the risk of diluting what she wanted her son to feel when he opened it. She turned off the hallway light and went to bed with that feeling of someone who has done something she doesn't know was right, but which was within the possibilities of what love allows one to try. She had put something of herself in that old backpack besides the money. She had put the hope that her son could still surprise her, that there was somewhere inside that difficult boy with curly hair, something that still responded to generosity with gratitude, something that was still capable of being surprised by what was inside things, and not just by what was on the surface. She slept more deeply than she had in weeks. Saturday morning arrived with that washed-out autumn light that entered through the gaps in the blinds and drew golden stripes on the wooden floor of the hallway. Sarah woke up before the others, as always, and before making coffee went to the corner of the living room where she had left the backpack leaning against the wall and stood looking at it for a moment. It looked even more modest in the daylight, that grey canvas backpack with the worn straps and the peeling faux leather at the edges. It looked exactly like what it was on the outside, a used, old object, without any aesthetic appeal that could attract the attention of someone who didn't know what was inside. Mark got up at 8. He had coffee with her in the kitchen, and the two talked about simple things, the week that had passed, the game he had watched on TV the night before, the living room renovation that had been planned for months and didn't get off the ground because neither of them had the energy to deal with carpenters and marble suppliers at the same time. It was a couple's conversation that existed in parallel to everything deeper and more complicated between them, but it was real just the same. It was a thread that still existed, and Sarah held onto it with the kind of care of someone who knows some threads are more important than they seem. Julian appeared at 9:20. He walked into the kitchen, dragging his feet with messy bedhead, wearing an old t-shirt and that early morning expression that sat somewhere between bad mood and indifference. He grabbed a piece of fruit from the bowl, ate standing up, looked at his phone, and was heading toward the hallway when Sarah called out, "Julian, there's something for you in the living room." He stopped, turned slightly. "What?" "Go see." There was something in her tone that was different from usual, not excessive excitement, but the tone of someone waiting for something with an attention that stays quiet and doesn't announce itself. Julian went to the living room with that dragging walk of someone who doesn't want to show they are curious and stopped in front of the backpack. He stood looking at it. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds, but it was the kind of silence that fits a lot inside. Sarah had approached the entrance to the living room and watched her son from behind. Mark had followed along without haste, coffee cup in hand, leaning against the doorframe with that calm curiosity of someone who doesn't know exactly what is about to happen, but perceives that something is. "What is this?" Julian said, and there was a tone in his voice that wasn't contempt yet, but evaluation, the kind he automatically exercised before any new object, a sort of instant screening where the item passed through a series of criteria Sarah knew well. Is it a good brand? Is it cool? Is it the kind of thing that will impress someone? The grey backpack failed every one of those criteria. "It's a gift," said Sarah. "Open it." Julian looked at her. Then he looked back at the backpack. There was an expression on his face she had learned to distinguish in recent years. It wasn't the expression of someone who is genuinely disappointed. It was the expression of someone who has already decided they are disappointed before checking, because checking would take work, and prior disappointment was faster and more comfortable. "That's just an old backpack," he said. "Open it, Julian," Sarah repeated, with the same calm as before. He crossed his arms. "Mom, seriously, I don't need an old backpack. If it's a birthday gift, it could at least be something new." Mark took a step toward his son. "Son, your mother is asking you to open it. Open the backpack." It was rare for Mark to speak with that tone, which had a different weight from their daily life, a tone that came from a place of authority rarely activated. Julian looked at his father, then at the backpack, and then picked up the strap with just 2 fingers, like someone picking up something they'd rather not be touching, and lifted it from the floor with a look of distaste he made no effort to hide. "It's horrible," he said. "Look at the state of this thing. Where did this even come from?" Sarah opened her mouth to say he needed to open it to find out what it was, but before she finished the sentence, Julian had already done what she most feared he would do. He threw the backpack. It wasn't a violent toss. It was a gesture of disposal. The same gesture one makes when dropping something in the trash, a movement of someone who dismisses what has no value and moves on. The backpack left his hand, spun in the air for a moment, and hit the edge of the sofa before falling to the floor on the other side, sliding near the balcony that overlooked the avenue. Mark set his coffee cup on the shelf with an excessive care that was the sign he used when he was angry, but didn't want to explode. Sarah stood still. Julian had already turned his back and was heading toward the hallway with that usual dragging walk, as if the episode were already in the past, as if the backpack and the gift and his mother's look were no longer matters needing attention. "You didn't even open it," Sarah said. Her voice came out lower than she had planned. He stopped, turned slightly over his shoulder. "I don't need to open it to know I don't want it. I'm not going to use an old ugly backpack, Mum. If it's a gift, let it be something that's actually worth something." And he walked into the hallway. Mark picked up his coffee cup again. Sarah stood in the living room with that feeling that came from very deep, which wasn't anger and wasn't sadness. It was something more like a confirmation she had hoped wouldn't come, and which had come anyway. She went to the backpack, picked it up from the floor, and checked if it had been crushed in the impact. It was intact. The zipper remained closed. The content inside remained exactly as she had organized it. She stood holding the strap and looking at the empty hallway where her son had disappeared. Mark said something she didn't hear properly because she was inside her own thoughts, and she answered with a monosyllable, and he went to the balcony with his coffee and stood looking at the city below, and Sarah stood there with the backpack in her hand for a while longer. Then she went to the balcony too, stood beside Mark without saying anything, and together they looked at New York, which existed below with all its indifferent grandeur. There were children playing ball on a court that overlooked Central Park in the distance. There were cars passing on the avenue. There was the distant sound of a lawnmower in some garden that couldn't be seen from there. The city did what the city always did. It continued without stopping, without waiting. It was then that Mark said with that quiet voice he used when he had made a decision, "Leave that backpack on the balcony. Give it to the doorman to give to someone who needs it." Sarah looked at him. "To whom?" "I don't know. To some kid." He said it without drama, like someone proposing a simple and practical thing to solve a problem that would otherwise just sit there taking up space. She looked at the backpack one more time. She thought about opening it and taking the money back, saving it, moving it to an account, forgetting that idea had ever existed. But there was something that stalled that thought, something she couldn't quite articulate but felt, that letting the backpack go where Mark had suggested was also a kind of response to what had happened there. Not a punishment, not a protest, but a thing life sometimes does, placing what was wasted into the hands of those who know how to receive. So she went down with the backpack to the doorman, Mr. Gilbert, a 60-year-old man with a grey mustache and a blue uniform he wore with the pride of someone who values their work. She explained it was a used but good backpack, that it had belonged to her husband, and that if there were any boy in the neighborhood who could use it, it would be a good destination. Mr. Gilbert said he knew someone exactly for that, a boy who worked around the area making deliveries, the son of a neighbor from down on the Lower East Side. A hard-working boy, he said, with the soft emphasis of someone saying something important without needing to raise their voice. A boy who wastes nothing. Sarah returned to the apartment without the backpack. She entered the elevator, went up the 18 floors, and stood looking at her own reflection in the polished steel door as the numbers climbed. There was a strangeness there that wasn't exactly relief and wasn't exactly sadness. It was something between the two, a feeling that the story of that morning had ended in a way she hadn't planned, but which was perhaps the only way that made sense. Leo Miller was 11 years old, with short, stiff hair that obeyed neither comb nor water, and a pair of sneakers that had been white when his mother bought them 2 years ago and now had the indefinite coloring of someone who walks many streets. He lived in a rented apartment on the Lower East Side, in the part of New York where the buildings are older and the sidewalks narrower and the shops close earlier, but where people know each other by name and ask one another how the family is doing with a naturalness that in wealthier neighborhoods sometimes disappears behind security cameras and intercoms. Leo's mother, Mrs. Miller, worked as a cleaning assistant in a commercial building in Midtown. She left at 5:30 in the morning and returned at 3 in the afternoon, which meant Leo was on his own in the afternoons more often than she would like. But Leo wasn't the kind of child who sat around idle. He had learned early on that being idle was a luxury his family couldn't sustain, not because anyone had told him that in those words, but because he had observed enough to understand. He had started making small deliveries for Mrs. Russo's grocery store on Saturdays when he was 9, carrying bags of groceries to neighborhood customers who ordered by phone and who paid a tip to the delivery boy. It wasn't big money. It was coins and low-value bills he gathered in a biscuit tin he kept under his bed. But there was something there he liked that went beyond the money, which was the feeling that the route through the streets of the Lower East Side was his, that he knew every corner and every face, and that there was a trust placed in him that was worth more than the numerical value of the tips. That Saturday, Mr. Gilbert had phoned Mr. Raymond, who was Mrs. Miller's neighbor, and Mr. Raymond had knocked on the apartment door while Leo was still eating lunch. "Mr. Gilbert says he has a backpack for you at the building up on the avenue," said the old man, without more elaboration than that. Leo had finished his plate of rice and beans with a fried egg on top, washed the plate, and headed out. The walk from the Lower East Side to the Upper East Side took about 40 minutes on foot, passing through the park, through the wide avenues that separated the two neighborhoods as if they were two different countries within the same city. Leo did this route sometimes when there were deliveries in more distant locations, and he had developed the habit of observing the differences with that dispassionate interest of someone cataloging the world as it is, without judgment, but also without naivety. There were buildings that had more parking spaces than apartments. There were gardens cared for by staff hired just for that. There were children his age being picked up in front of buildings by cars he recognized from TV commercials. He observed all of that with those eyes Mrs. Miller called old person eyes, because they were eyes that stayed quiet in front of what they saw, without the agitation expected from children. Mr. Gilbert was at the front desk when Leo arrived, with his grey mustache and blue uniform, and that way of treating visitors that was neither exclusive nor familiar. It was just correct, which is a different thing from both. He said a resident had left a backpack for donation, that he had thought of him and handed over the object without ceremony. Leo took the backpack by the straps and looked at it. Grey canvas, faux leather at the edges, straps that were still firm. It had a main zipper that squeaked slightly when he pulled it a few inches to see if it worked, and it worked. On the outside it looked old, but it wasn't torn. It didn't smell. It was just used, which is different from ruined. "Thank you, Mr. Gilbert," he said. The doorman made a gesture with his hand that meant, "You're welcome," and also meant, "You can go." And Leo walked back along the sidewalk with the backpack in his hand, feeling its weight. There was something inside. He hadn't noticed at the front desk, but now, carrying it, it was perceptible. The zipper was closed and he had only pulled it a few inches to test the mechanism, but the weight was real. The backpack wasn't empty. It must be something the resident forgot inside, he thought. Old clothes maybe, or books. He didn't open it there on the sidewalk. It wasn't the place. There were people passing. There was the usual movement of the avenue, and he had the habit of not doing things in the middle of the way when he could do them calmly. He put the backpack on his back, adjusted the straps, and began the walk back. The weight was greater than old clothes usually weighed. It was denser than books too. There was something in the weight distribution that was different, more compact, more uniform. He went along thinking about it without reaching any conclusion, and when he entered the apartment, closed the door and sat on the bed in the room that was his alone, but only fit the bed and a shelf with some books. He opened the backpack. He sat in absolute silence for a time. He wouldn't later be able to estimate precisely. It could have been 10 seconds or 2 minutes. The old person eyes Mrs. Miller knew well were wider than normal, and there was in them an expression that wasn't greed, wasn't euphoria, but something more like a quiet shock. The shock of someone coming across something that is far beyond the proportions the day had promised to be. Folded bills, hundreds of bills, arranged with that care of someone who had placed each one there with intention. He pulled one out with 2 fingers, unfolded it. $100. He took another. 50. He took a third from the bottom. 100 again. The compartment was full. Full of money that wasn't his, that couldn't be his, that had reached him by a mistake, or by the oversight of someone who had left the backpack for donation without checking the contents. Leo sat looking at the bills in his hand. Then he looked at the backpack. Then he looked at the window of the room, which overlooked a brick wall and a patch of sky that was lead-colored that afternoon. He was 11 years old. He made deliveries to gather coins in a biscuit tin. The school he attended had chairs with missing screws and a water fountain that worked on alternate days. Mrs. Miller woke up at 5:30 to get to work by bus, and sometimes came home with pains in her hands that she said were from so much scrubbing, but which he knew were also from holding heavy things for hours. The money in the backpack could change things. Concrete, real things, the kind that make a difference in the day-to-day of a life lived up close, where every dollar counts and every expense is weighed before being made. He sat with that thought for a while. He let it stay, didn't expel it, didn't pretend it hadn't appeared. He was too honest for that. There was a real temptation there that deserved to be recognized as such and not swept under the rug of easy virtue. But there was also another thing, quieter than the temptation, deeper, which had been planted in him over years by Mrs. Miller with simple words and consistent actions. What isn't yours, you return. Not because the law says so, not because someone is looking, but because your word and your character are the only things no one can take from you as long as you don't give them away for free. Leo folded the bills back with the same care he had taken them out, put them inside the backpack and closed the zipper. He sat on the edge of the bed with the backpack in his lap for a few more moments, then got up and went to the kitchen to wait for Mrs. Miller to arrive. She came in at 3:15, put her bag on the chair, and went straight to the sink to wash her hands as she always did. Leo was at the table with the backpack leaning against the wall beside the chair and a glass of orange juice he had made for her. Mrs. Miller looked at the glass, then at her son, then at the backpack. What backpack is that? Mr. Gilbert gave it to me. It's a donation from a resident at the building on the avenue. But there's money inside, Mom. Mrs. Miller stood still with her hands still wet. Money? A lot of bills. I didn't count, but it's a lot. She dried her hands on the dish towel, went to the chair where he was and opened the backpack. She sat looking at the contents with that expression he had expected, which was a mixture of surprise and immediate seriousness. The face of someone who recognizes the weight of a situation before saying anything. You did well to call me, she said. Tomorrow morning we're going there to return it. Leo nodded. I know. Mrs. Miller closed the backpack, held it in her hand for a moment. Then she looked at her son with those eyes that were like his, quiet and attentive, and said something he would keep for a long time. Money that comes in through the wrong door goes out through the window, but what you do with what is right stays with you forever. He drank his juice. She went to heat up dinner, and the backpack stayed leaning against the kitchen wall, quiet and full, waiting for the next day. Sunday began with a fine drizzle that wasn't enough to be called rain, but was enough to make the sidewalk slippery and shoulders damp. Leo woke up before the alarm, as he usually did on days when there was something important ahead, and lay for a few minutes looking at the ceiling of the room in the dark before dawn. The backpack was where he had left it the night before, leaning against the kitchen wall, with the weight of what it carried inside and with all the story he didn't yet completely understand. Mrs. Miller was already up when he reached the kitchen. She had made oatmeal and had set out clean clothes for both of them. She was like that. She organized things before organizing thoughts, as if the physical order of the environment were the first step to facing any complicated situation. Leo ate the oatmeal in silence, put on the clean shirt, put on the sneakers that were no longer white, and was ready. Before leaving, Mrs. Miller opened the backpack once more, counted part of the money by sight without taking the bills out, closed the zipper and looked at her son. Are you okay? I am, he said. And he was. He had slept well. He had woken up right. There was the kind of clarity in his chest that appears when the decision is already made, and what remains is just to act. There was no conflict. There was the path, and he would follow it. The walk to the Upper East Side that Sunday morning had a different rhythm from the previous afternoon. There were fewer cars, fewer people on the sidewalks, and the drizzle made everything quieter, as if the city had agreed to lower the volume for a few hours. Mrs. Miller walked beside her son with that same posture, Straight spine, firm steps, the small umbrella she carried in her bag open over the two of them, with an inclination that protected her son more than herself. They didn't speak much on the way. There was nothing to talk about. What needed to be done was clear, and the conversation Mrs. Miller had insisted on having the night before had already said everything necessary. Mr. Gilbert was at the front desk when they arrived, this time with a different expression from the day before, more attentive, like someone perceiving that the story had continued in a way he hadn't predicted. Leo introduced his mother and explained that there was money inside the backpack, and that they needed to return it to the resident who had left it for donation without realizing what was inside. The doorman raised both eyebrows at the same time, looked at the backpack, then at the boy, then at the mother, and then picked up the intercom. The apartment on the 18th floor was notified. Sarah had slept well on Saturday night and had woken up on Sunday with that lightness that only appears after a decision, even if the decision wasn't made in a completely conscious way. She had thought about the backpack a few times throughout the previous day, had felt a pang of regret when she remembered the bills she had folded with such care, but there was also something that resisted the regret, a stubborn feeling that the fate of that money had been decided the moment Julian had thrown it aside without even looking inside. When the intercom rang and Mr. Gilbert said there was a boy and a lady at the front desk wanting to return a backpack they had received for donation, Sarah stood still with the handset in her hand for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were. Then she said she would be right down. Julian was still sleeping. Mark had left early for a business lunch that had been scheduled last minute, as often happened on weekends, and the apartment was silent when Sarah closed the door and went down in the elevator with that stomach knot of someone who doesn't know exactly what they will find, but presumes it will be something that matters. The woman waiting at the front desk was about 40 years old, with short black hair, simple clothes, and the posture of someone accustomed to staying on their feet, regardless of what the day puts in front of them. Beside her was a boy of about 11, stiff hair that obeyed nothing, worn sneakers, and eyes Sarah noticed before anything else, because they were the kind of eyes that stay quiet when they look at you, as if they were listening too. The boy was holding the backpack by the straps with both hands. "Good afternoon," said Mrs. Miller. "Are you the owner of this backpack?" Sarah looked at the backpack. "Yes, I am." It came out in a quieter tone than she had planned. "It was left for donation here at the front desk." "It was, you're right. Mr. Gilbert gave it to my son yesterday afternoon. But there's money inside, a lot of bills. My son brought it back to return it." Sarah sat looking at Mrs. Miller. Then she looked at the boy. Then she looked at the backpack. There was a sequence of perceptions there that didn't all arrive at the same time. They came in one by one like people entering through a narrow door, and each one required a second of processing. First, she had put money in the backpack. Second, she had forgotten that completely when she told Mark to let the doorman give the backpack to someone who needed it. She had forgotten because the backpack had become the symbol of her son's disregard, and the decision to let it go had been emotional enough to override the memory of the contents. Third, that boy in worn sneakers had found a backpack full of money and had walked 40 minutes to return what wasn't his. She stood looking at the boy for a time that was probably too long, and then she crouched slightly until she was at his eye level. "What is your name?" "Leo Miller." "Leo, did you open the backpack?" "I opened it at home, to see if there was anything of the owner's." "And when you saw the money?" He made a pause that wasn't of hesitation, but of someone thinking how to say something precisely. "I kept it to return it. It's yours. It's not mine." Sarah was silent. There was a pressure behind her eyes she recognized as the announcement of tears, and she didn't fight it. She let it come. But she also didn't let them fall, because there was something keeping her very attentive, very present in that moment, which was the awareness that what was happening was important in a way she needed to keep whole. She straightened up, turned to Mrs. Miller, and said, "Thank you," with a voice that wasn't enough for what she felt. She knew that, but it was what was available at that moment. Mrs. Miller made a gesture with her head that was both modest and firm, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition, but doesn't refuse it either. Sarah took the backpack. She opened the zipper in front of the two of them. checked the contents and closed it again. Everything was intact, every bill in place, every fold as it had been made. She looked at Leo once more. "Do you work, Leo?" "I make deliveries in the neighborhood on weekends." "And school?" "Monday to Friday in the morning." Sarah sat looking at him with that attention he had noticed from the beginning, an attention different from what adults usually dedicated to him, which was generally the quick attention of someone fulfilling a social obligation before moving on to the next subject. This was different. It was the attention of someone who is truly seeing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Did you think about keeping the money?" The question was too direct for most adults to ask a child in that context, but there was an honesty in it that wasn't cruelty. It was respect. It was the kind of question one asks someone when one believes they are capable of a real answer. Leo looked at her for a second. "I did," he said. "But then I thought it wasn't mine." Sarah nodded slowly. She stood with the backpack in her hand and looked at that boy for one more moment, and there was something in her that was changing while she looked. Some gear turning in a direction she hadn't planned, but that made complete sense, with that logic of things that arrive at the right moment. She told Mrs. Miller she needed a moment, went into the elevator lobby, and stood with the backpack pressed against her chest for a few seconds. She thought of Julian sleeping on the 18th floor. She thought of the chair pushed with violence in the bakery. She thought of the backpack being thrown without the contents even being checked. She thought of that boy in worn sneakers who had walked 40 minutes with a fortune on his back to return what wasn't his. She went back to the front desk. She opened the backpack again. She took out a portion of the bills, just a portion, and held them out to Mrs. Miller. "Please take this. It's not charity. It's what is right. Your son did something most people wouldn't do." Mrs. Miller stood looking at the bills in Sarah's outstretched hand, with that seriousness that wasn't pride. It was evaluation. Then she looked at Leo. The boy said nothing, but there was an expression on his face of someone who trusts his mother to decide. Mrs. Miller accepted a part of what had been offered, with a dignity Sarah wouldn't soon forget. As the two of them walked out the glass door of the front desk, back onto the wet sidewalk, Sarah stood watching them through the glass. The drizzle continued fine. Leo put on the poncho he had folded in his pants pocket as they walked. Mrs. Miller opened the small umbrella, and the two disappeared down the sidewalk with that firm step of someone who knows where they are going. Sarah stood there long after they had gone, with the backpack in her hands and a certainty that had arrived slowly, without noise but which was already completely settled. That boy and her son needed to meet. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But she knew that this meeting was necessary in the way some things are necessary, even before we have words to explain why. Sarah spent the rest of Sunday with her thoughts divided between the present and the recent past, like someone trying to assemble a puzzle and realizing they need to check if all the pieces belong to the same box. Julian had woken up near noon, eaten the lunch she had left in the fridge with a note explaining how to heat it, and gone back to his room without asking where she had been in the morning. Mark returned from his business lunch at 4 in the afternoon, with that weekend fatigue that wasn't physical, but the fatigue of someone who spends their free time also working, and who ended up falling asleep on the sofa before dinner with the remote still in his hand. Sarah sat on the balcony with a cup of tea that went cold while she thought. There was something about that boy that wouldn't leave her head. It wasn't just the gesture itself, which was already extraordinary enough to justify attention. It was the whole package. The way he had answered her direct question with an honesty that didn't perform virtue, that simply reported what had happened inside him, with that naturalness of someone who doesn't need to embellish their own integrity for it to exist. He was 11 years old and had looked at her with those quiet eyes, without asking for anything, without expecting applause, just delivering what wasn't his, and that was it. Leo Miller. She had repeated the name mentally several times, like someone memorizing something they didn't want to lose. He lived on the Lower East Side, made deliveries on weekends, went to school Monday to Friday. His mother was named Mrs. Miller. Wait, they shared a last name. Sarah paused at the coincidence. His mother worked as a cleaning assistant, had the posture of someone who had taught her son what was necessary, without many words being needed. There was no mention of a father, Sarah had noticed that at the front desk, the absence of any reference to a man in Mrs. Miller's story, the way she had said, "my son," instead of "our son," the plural that hadn't appeared at any moment. It could be anything. It could be separation, it could be abandonment, it could be one of so many situations New York knew well. But it had remained as a gap in the picture she was trying to assemble. On Monday morning, after taking Julian to school in silence, she returned to the Upper East Side and went to the front desk. Mr. Gilbert was in the same place, grey mustache, blue uniform, and that patience that seemed to have no bottom. She greeted him, asked how his weekend had been, and then asked, with the care of someone who doesn't want to seem meddlesome but needs to know, if he knew anything else about the boy. If he knew where the boy worked, what school he went to, if there was any way to contact the mother. Mr. Gilbert scratched his mustache. "I know he works at Mrs. Rousseau's grocery store down on the Lower East Side. And the mother, she works in that office building over on Wall Street. I know Mr. Raymond, who's their neighbor. I can ask for the number if you'd like." She did. She wrote the number in her phone, thanked Mr. Gilbert with more genuineness than he was used to receiving from residents of the building, and went out onto the sidewalk with a plan that wasn't yet completely formed, but had a direction. She thought about calling Mrs. Miller that same day, but something stopped her. There was a hastiness in calling without knowing quite what to say, and Sarah wanted to know what to say before saying it. So she decided to do something else first, talk to Mark. She waited for dinner that night. Julian had stayed home with a school project due Tuesday, and after dinner went straight to his room. Sarah and Mark stayed sitting at the table with the wine glasses she had opened, and she told him everything. The backpack, the money she had forgotten inside, the impulsive decision to let Mark give it to the doorman, and then the boy who had appeared Sunday morning with the backpack intact to return it. Mark listened without interrupting, with that way of listening he had when he knew something was serious, leaning slightly forward, wine glass still in his hand. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "How much was in the backpack?" he asked. She told him the amount. She had been honest about that, and in that honesty was also the second step of a conversation that was timed to happen. The conversation about the investment, about the fund, about the months of worry she had carried alone. Mark sat looking at her. "Sarah, why didn't you tell me before?" She held his gaze. "Because I wanted to try to resolve it alone, and because I was ashamed." He didn't say she had been wrong. He didn't say she should have consulted him before investing. He only said with that quiet voice that appeared in the moments when he was more the Mark she had married, and less the COO who arrived late, "You should have told me." She said she knew. They were silent for a moment that wasn't awkward. It was the silence of two adults who had reached a point where honesty had appeared after a delay and who were processing what to do with it. Then Mark said, "And the boy? What do you want to do?" Sarah placed her wineglass on the table. "I want him and Julian to meet." Mark opened his eyes a bit. "Why?" "Because Julian threw that backpack away without looking inside, and a boy who has much less than he does not only looked, but returned it." Mark sat processing that. Then he said, "Julian is going to resist." "I know, but it needs to happen anyway." That week Sarah phoned Mrs. Miller, who answered with a cautious voice that transformed into receptivity when Sarah explained carefully what she had in mind. It wasn't paternalism. It wasn't an intention to fix anyone's life. It was a mother who had seen something in a boy that had taught her something important, and who wanted her own son to be able to see it too. Mrs. Miller listened with that seriousness Sarah had recognized at the front desk, and then was silent for a time that was long enough for Sarah to start thinking she had said it wrong. But Mrs. Miller said, "Saturday works." Sarah said thank you, with a relief that was deeper than expected. There was also another thing that had been circling Sarah's thoughts since Sunday, something she hadn't mentioned to Mark or Mrs. Miller because it was still vague, still just a feeling and not a concrete fact. It was about the boy, about Leo. There was something in that face, in those quiet and attentive eyes, that she had seen somewhere before. Not an exact face, but an expression, a way of being. She hadn't been able to place where she had seen it until Wednesday afternoon, when she was in the building's elevator with a grocery bag, and the door opened on the 12th floor, and Mrs. Brooks, who lived there, stepped in. She was married to an architect Sarah knew vaguely from social events in the industry. They exchanged those 3 elevator sentences, people swap, that aren't superficial. They are just the size time allows. But it wasn't Mrs. Brooks who brought the thought. It was what she was holding in her hand, a business magazine, the kind that usually has executives and entrepreneurs on flashy covers. The cover was facing Sarah while the woman held it, and in the center of it was a photograph of Robert Sterling, the owner of Sterling Developments, the man Mark had worked for 11 years. He was in a suit with that serious and controlled expression powerful men learn to use for photographs, but there was something there in the eyes that the camera had captured unintentionally, something that wasn't seriousness, but was attention, a quiet and deep attention she had seen somewhere else very recently. She looked at the photo for a second, then at the elevator door opening on the 18th floor. She took the bags, left, went to the kitchen. She put away the groceries slowly, each item in its place, as if the mechanical act of organizing the pantry could also organize her thoughts. Robert Sterling. She had crossed paths with him a few times at company events over the years, the end-of-year luncheons, the ribbon cuttings for developments Mark took her to represent the family. He was a man in his 50s, tall, dark hair with the first signs of receding, that kind of presence that occupies the space of a room without needing to speak. She had exchanged a few sentences with him on different occasions and had thought there was something in him that was different from what she expected of a man in that position, something more contained, less performative. She went to the living room, opened her phone, and searched his name in the news tab. She found the same magazine photo in a profile published 2 months earlier. She read the text. There was a paragraph near the end that she read twice because the first time she hadn't completely processed it. The entrepreneur maintains a discreet profile in his private life, rarely mentions family, and there is no public record of children or a spouse. Sources close to him indicate that Sterling strongly values privacy. No children registered publicly. Sarah sat looking at the phone screen for a while. The feeling that had started as a vague recognition of similar eyes was becoming something more concrete, more specific, which she still didn't have the courage to name completely, but which was there, quiet and insistent, waiting for her to join the missing pieces. Sarah spent the next 2 days trying to find a way to confirm what had started as a suspicion, before turning something that could very well be just a coincidence, fueled by the imagination of someone looking at it with too much attention, into a certainty. It could be that. 2 pairs of quiet and attentive eyes in 2 different faces proved nothing. The city was full of children who hadn't mentioned their father. There were a million possible explanations for the absence of a father in Mrs. Miller's conversation, but there was one thing that wasn't explained so easily, and that thing was Robert Sterling's decision to raise a son away from luxury. She had read that in a different, older article she had found during an hour of searching on Thursday afternoon, a magazine profile published nearly 4 years ago where the entrepreneur had given a rare interview about his philosophy of life. At one point, when the journalist had asked about legacy, Sterling had said something that had stayed recorded in the article as a quote, "I believe character is formed in the friction with reality, not in the protection from it. My greatest concern in anything I build, in the company and outside it, is that it does not produce people who do not know what life costs." The phrase could be from a man talking about business. It could be from a weekend philosopher who had discovered a good line. But there was also the possibility it was from a father who had made a concrete, specific decision based on that conviction. Sarah closed the laptop and sat at the desk in the apartment's office for a long time. There was a responsible path to take here, she knew. It wasn't simply going to Mark and saying she thought the boss's son was living on a street on the Lower East Side, making grocery store deliveries. That would be irresponsible without having any concrete evidence, and the consequences of a wrong accusation in that context could be significant in a way she didn't even want to imagine. There was also the question of Julian. Saturday was approaching, and there was the meeting arranged with Mrs. Miller and Leo that needed to happen before anything else, because that was the original reason, the real purpose that had moved the last few days. The rest, the suspicion, the coincidence of the eyes, the magazine article, all of that was a parallel story running beside the main story, and Sarah was disciplined enough not to let the side story swallow the center. On Friday night, she sat with Julian after dinner. Mark was present too, and there was a tension in the living room that wasn't explicit, but that Sarah recognized as the kind that precedes conversations people need to have, but that aren't easy to start. She explained to her son what had happened with the backpack. She explained in detail, not sparing her son the information that the discarded object was full of money, and that there was a boy his age who had walked all that way to return it. Julian listened with an expression that tried to be indifferent and didn't quite succeed. There were one or two times when something crossed his face that wasn't exactly embarrassment, but was close. He looked at his hands, looked at the off television, looked away. "I didn't know there was money inside," he said finally. Sarah said nothing for a second. Then she said, "I know, but you also didn't check." He was quiet. Mark said with that voice of few words that carried more than it seemed, "Tomorrow you're going to that boy's neighborhood with your mother. You're going to see his day, and you're going to stay quiet and observe." Julian turned to his father with an expression that wanted to be a protest, but he didn't say anything. There was something in Mark's tone that left no room for negotiation, and Julian was smart enough to recognize that tone when it appeared, even if it was rare. The conversation ended without Julian explicitly agreeing, but the silence was an answer everyone understood. On Saturday morning, Sarah and Julian went down to the street at 9 o'clock. She had told her son they would take the subway. She waited for the protest, and the protest didn't come, which was a small but not insignificant thing. Julian was silent on the station platform, with his hands in his hoodie pockets and headphones hanging around his neck, but not on his ears, and Sarah stood beside him without trying to fill the silence with conversation. The subway arrived. They got on, and Julian looked at the people around him with that look Sarah had learned to monitor, expecting the gesture of contempt, the subtle grimace, the low-voiced comment, but the look stayed neutral. There was a containment there she wasn't used to seeing in him in public spaces he had previously decided weren't for him. They got off at the station nearest the Lower East Side and walked to Mrs. Russo's grocery store. Sarah had arranged with Mrs. Miller that they would arrive at 10, which was when Leo usually began his Saturday shift. The street was narrow, the sidewalks were irregular, and there was the smell of coffee coming from a small bakery on the corner with its doors open. Julian walked beside his mother without complaining. The grocery store was a corner establishment with shelves to the ceiling and an old-fashioned scale on the counter that coexisted with a digital scanner without any contradiction. Mrs. Russo was a woman in her 60s, white hair tied back, who recognized Sarah by name when she introduced herself because Mrs. Miller had warned they would come. Leo was arranging shelves when they entered, with a bag of flour he carried with both hands and placed carefully in the right spot. When he saw Sarah, he turned with an expression of calm recognition, without excessive surprise. When he saw Julian, he was silent for a second, calculating. Julian stood at the entrance of the grocery store looking at Leo, and Leo looked back at him with those quiet eyes that didn't judge but also didn't give up space. Sarah made the introduction simply. "Julian, this is Leo. Leo, this is my son Julian." The two looked at each other. There was no immediate greeting. There was a kind of mutual evaluation happening, the kind that happens between children when they haven't yet decided what to think of each other. Sarah stayed quiet and let it be. It was Mrs. Russo who broke the silence with that practicality of someone who has a store to run and no time for ceremony. "Leo, can you show the boy how you do the deliveries?" And Leo said he could. They spent the following morning traversing the streets of the Lower East Side with a list of orders in hand. Leo carried the delivery bag, knew the addresses by heart, greeted people by name, and was greeted by name too, by adults who treated him with the respect given to someone trusted. An old man with white hair who received a package of salt and rice and said, "Thank you, Leo," as if thank you had weight. A lady who was waiting at the window and waved from afar when she saw him turn the corner. Julian walked behind with his hands in his pockets, observing. Sarah walked a little behind the two, observing too, but observing her son observing. There was something there, in Julian's posture, that she noticed with attention. There was no disdain. There was an attention she didn't see in her son often, an attention that seemed genuine, the kind that isn't produced deliberately, but appears when something around is different enough from what is known to require the senses to adjust. At the end of the morning, after the deliveries, the three stopped at a small diner on the street below. Sarah ordered 3 juices. Leo asked for passion fruit without sugar, because that was how he always ordered it. Julian also asked for passion fruit, because he had heard the other boy ask for it, which was the smallest thing and at the same time the first time that day he had followed the example of someone who wasn't in his usual circle. They sat, and for a time were in silence. Sarah didn't interfere. She had learned that week that silence was sometimes the space where important things happened, and filling that space with words would be the same as closing the window when the air was starting to come in. It was Julian who spoke first. He said, without looking directly at Leo, but without looking away completely, "Don't you get angry about working on Saturday?" Leo thought for a second. "No. I'd rather work than sit still." Julian sat looking at his juice cup. "Why?" "Because when I work, I know I did something. It makes sense at the end of the day." Sarah looked at the cup in front of her so as not to let either of them see the expression on her face, which was a mixture of hope and something she hadn't felt in a long time and recognized as the beginning of a possibility. The diner had a small television mounted on the wall, playing a cooking show without sound, and a ceiling fan that spun slowly without making much difference in the early afternoon heat. Sarah ordered more juice, this time for herself, and left the 2 boys sitting on the opposite side of the table without intervening, just existing beside them, available but not in the way. Julian had asked the question without looking directly at Leo, and Leo had answered without needing to be encouraged. And then there was a silence that this time had a different texture from the previous silences of the morning. It wasn't the silence of 2 strangers who don't know what to say. It was the silence of 2 boys who were, each in their own way, evaluating what had been said and deciding what to do with it. It was Julian who continued, this time looking at the cup but not away. "What do you do with the money you earn?" Leo said he saved a part to help with bills, and a part he had started saving to buy a scientific calculator he needed for school next year, because the math teacher had said they would need one, and he wanted to have his own instead of borrowing. Julian sat looking at him. "A calculator?" He said it without the usual tone of disdain, which Sarah noticed. There was only surprise there, the genuine surprise of someone encountering an unexpected answer. "Yeah," said Leo. "The ones they lend at school are old and sometimes keys are missing." Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, lower than his usual tone, "My school backpack costs more than a scientific calculator." There was no pride in the sentence. There was only a realization. The kind that appears when someone perceives a proportion they hadn't seen before because they had never placed the 2 things side by side. Leo didn't answer. There was nothing to answer, and he knew it. Sarah drank her juice and looked out the window at the street outside. There was a mother passing with a stroller, a dog tied to a post in front of a closed shop, 2 teenagers on a parked motorcycle talking while waiting for the light. The ordinary city, the everyday city, which existed in parallel with the city of high floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that Julian knew as the only possible scenery. They left the diner near 1 in the afternoon. Leo said he needed to go back to the grocery store to help Mrs. Russo close the Saturday register, which was part of the job too, and the 2 boys walked ahead with that distance between them that wasn't hostility but wasn't yet proximity. It was the space of those still calibrating. On the way back, Julian walked beside Sarah and was quiet for a time she respected. When they were almost reaching the subway station, he said without preparation, "Did he really return the whole backpack?" "Yes," said Sarah. "With everything inside, nothing missing." Julian assimilated that. Then he said, "I wouldn't have returned it." The sentence came out with a naturalness Sarah found more shocking than if he had shouted. It wasn't malice, it was honesty, the uncomfortable kind that appears when someone says out loud what most prefer not to acknowledge about themselves. And in that honesty, however disturbing it was, There was a sign that something had moved in that boy that morning. Sarah said, "I know you're being honest, but that's exactly what I wanted you to see." He didn't answer further. They entered the subway, returned to the Upper East Side, and Saturday continued. The following week, Sarah phoned Mrs. Miller and asked if Leo could spend an afternoon at their house, if she felt it would be comfortable for her son. There was a natural hesitation, the hesitation of someone who doesn't want their son to feel out of place, and Sarah understood that and said it would be simple, just an afternoon, the two boys, nothing elaborate. Mrs. Miller said she would ask Leo. Leo said he could. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon after school with the new backpack Sarah had discovered Mrs. Miller had bought, with part of the money she had accepted at the front desk. A simple dark blue backpack he carried with the same care he carried all things. Sarah received him at the door with a juice ready and took him to the living room where Julian was sitting on the sofa with a video game controller in his hand. Julian looked at Leo. Leo looked at Julian. The apartment was large enough that the contrast between the two worlds hung in the air for a moment, but neither of them named it. "Do you play?" Julian asked, slightly raising the controller. Leo said he had never played that specific game, but had played others at a friend's house. Julian threw the second controller to him. "Learn fast." Sarah went to the kitchen. She stayed listening from afar to the sounds of the game and the voices of the two, first with that formality of those still getting to know each other, then gradually, with more naturalness, with the specific naturalness of boys playing together, who discover that the game creates its own language that doesn't need previous context to work. She prepared a snack without anyone asking, took it to the living room, and returned to the kitchen. She didn't want to be too present. She had learned in those weeks that the excessive presence of adults was capable of freezing exactly the things that needed to happen freely. When it was time for Leo to leave, with the apartment already with the late afternoon light entering through the windows, Julian went to the door with him and said bye without Sarah having asked him to do so. A small thing, but not insignificant. After the door closed, Julian went to his room without saying anything, and Sarah stayed in the living room sitting on the sofa where the two boys had sat, with the two video game controllers still on the coffee table. She sat looking at the controllers for a while, thinking about how sometimes things change so quietly that you almost don't notice while it's happening, and only see it when you look back. There was also that other story running under everything, the suspicion she still hadn't confirmed or discarded. In recent days she had done more research, this time more targeted, and had found some things that proved nothing, but also didn't undo the pattern she had begun to see. Robert Sterling had been born in New York, raised in a simple neighborhood, had studied in public school and built the company from zero, the kind of biography he mentioned rarely in interviews, but when he did, he mentioned it with an emphasis that went beyond the veneer of humility the rich perform to seem accessible. There was something in how he talked about the value of work, about what adversity teaches, that was too concrete to be just rhetoric. There was also a detail she had found in a social note from 3 years ago, buried in the middle of a column about a charity event. Robert Sterling had attended the event alone, as usual, but had signed the guest book with handwriting the photographer had captured by accident, and next to the name, there was a handwritten addendum that said, "For Leo, with love." The photographer had posted the image without realizing what they had captured, and the post had stayed there without anyone paying enough attention to notice. Sarah had noticed. She had stayed looking at those words on the phone screen for a long time, feeling the suspicion become something more solid, closer to a certainty. For Leo. Robert Sterling had written in a charity event note the name of someone called Leo with a love that didn't fit the distance of a simple employee or distant nephew. She still hadn't said anything to Mark. The reason was simple. Once that information went to Mark, he would be in the impossible position of knowing something about the boss that perhaps the boss didn't want anyone to know, and having to decide what to do with it. That had consequences she couldn't completely map out, and she didn't want to put her husband in a trap without having more than suppositions. But there was a Saturday approaching, a new meeting Mrs. Miller had suggested, this time on the Lower East Side, where the boys would spend the afternoon and where Sarah had promised she would be. And there was the growing certainty that at that meeting, in that neighborhood, in Leo's natural environment, something that was waiting to appear would finally reveal itself. Saturday arrived with a sun that warmed without burning, the kind New York reserves for days when it seems the city has decided to be kind. Sarah and Julian arrived at the Lower East Side at 2 in the afternoon and were met by Mrs. Miller at the door of the building, a 4-story construction with a white tile facade that had turned grey with the years, and with a plant in a paint tin on the first-floor windowsill that was green and firm. Leo was inside finishing lunch when they arrived. Mrs. Miller received them with coffee, and with that hospitality without exaggeration, that is the kind that doesn't need a set table to make someone feel welcome. The apartment was small and clean, with the kind of care seen in places where everything has a place because space is precious. There was a shelf with some books in the living room, a vase with artificial flowers on the television, a rug that had been recently washed and smelled of coconut soap. Julian entered and stood for a moment at the entrance of the living room looking at the space. Sarah stayed attentive, waiting for the gesture, the look that evaluated and discarded, the expression he usually had in places that didn't correspond to his standard. But what she saw was different. He looked at the apartment with that attention that had appeared the previous Saturday in the streets of the Lower East Side. That quiet attention of someone recalibrating their eye for something they don't know. Leo came out of the kitchen, drying his hands on the dish towel, and greeted the two with naturalness. He asked Julian if he wanted to see the neighborhood. Julian said he did. The two went out without Sarah, who stayed in the living room with Mrs. Miller drinking coffee and talking with the dual attention of someone participating in a conversation and at the same time monitoring what was happening outside the window. There was a small park on the street below where the neighborhood children usually gathered on weekends, and that was where the two went. The conversation between Sarah and Mrs. Miller began with practical things: how work is going, how school is going, how Leo is doing in his grades, and deepened naturally in the way conversations between mothers sometimes deepen when children aren't present and there is enough trust in the environment. Mrs. Miller spoke about her son with that love that doesn't need ornaments, direct and concrete, mentioning achievements with the same lightness she mentioned difficulties. Sarah listened to it all with attention, and then, with the care of someone opening a door she doesn't quite know where it leads, she asked about Leo's father. There was a silence. Mrs. Miller placed her coffee cup on the coffee table with a delicacy that was also a pause and sat looking at her hands for a moment. "It's a long story," she said finally. "You don't have to tell if you don't want to," said Sarah. "But I ask because some time ago I noticed some things, and I want you to know that nothing you tell me will leave this room." Mrs. Miller looked at her. There was in that look an evaluation Sarah had learned to recognize as the look that woman used before making important decisions. It lasted a few seconds, then Mrs. Miller took a deep breath. "Leo's father is a man I knew when we were young, before he was what he is today, before everything he built. We loved each other in a way that was real, but that life separated bit by bit, first by circumstances, then by distance. And by the time I found out I was pregnant with Leo, he was already on another path that I didn't fit into anymore." Sarah didn't interrupt. "He knew about Leo," Mrs. Miller continued, "from the beginning. We agreed in a way that neither of us was happy about, but that both thought was right. Leo would stay with me, grow up in the real world, learn the value of things with his hands, not with checks. It was the father's decision. And I agreed, because deep down I believe the same as he does. That character doesn't come from a rich cradle. It comes from what a person does when no one is giving anything for free." "And Leo knows?" asked Sarah, with a voice that came out lower than she had planned. "He knows he has a father. He knows his father exists and that he cares. But he doesn't know who he is, not by full name, not by position. They talk. The father sends letters. They have a place near here where Leo goes sometimes to leave a note, and where sometimes there's a letter waiting. It's the way they found." Sarah sat looking at Mrs. Miller. Then she said, with all the delicacy the situation required, "I think I know who Leo's father is." The silence that followed was different from all the others that had existed in that room. It was the silence of something that had been inside a closed box and suddenly found enough opening to begin to come out. Mrs. Miller looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that seemed much older than surprise. Something like the soft fatigue of someone who carried a secret for so long that the prospect of no longer needing to carry it alone produced a sensation that was strange and relieving at the same time. She didn't say the name, but she also didn't deny it. She sat looking at Sarah with those eyes the son had inherited, quiet and deep. Outside, in the park on the street below, the two boys had stopped in front of a wooden bench painted green that sat under a large maple tree. Leo had taken a folded paper from his pocket and told Julian, with that naturalness he said everything, that it was the place he sometimes came to think about his father. Julian looked at the paper. "What is that?" "It's a letter he sent me. I bring it sometimes and read it here." "But you don't live with him?" "No, we don't live together. But he exists." Julian sat looking at the bench and the maple tree and the folded paper in the other boy's hand, and there was in that look something Sarah, if she had been present, would have recognized as something new, something she hadn't seen before in her son. It was a small but real vulnerability, the vulnerability of someone being touched by something they weren't expecting to feel. Leo unfolded the letter with the care of someone taking care of something precious and began to read in a low voice. Not to Julian, but to the air ahead, to the green wooden bench and the maple tree and the small park on the Lower East Side that existed there as his territory. The letter was from his father, and in it were things about what the father expected of the son, about how much he missed him, about how there were days when the distance weighed in a way words couldn't describe, but that there was a reason behind all of it, and that reason was love, which sometimes expresses itself in ways the world doesn't understand, but the heart that loves knows how to recognize. Leo stopped reading. He sat looking at the paper, and then he said, still looking at the letter and not at Julian, "Sometimes I miss him a lot, but then I remember what he writes, that we'll see each other when the time is right. And I believe that." Julian sat looking at Leo for a time that was long enough for anything else in him that was hard or closed to reach the limit of what it could sustain. Here was a boy who worked on Saturday, who slept in a room that fit only the bed and a shelf, who saved coins for a scientific calculator, and who read letters from his father in a small park in a neighborhood Julian had never visited before those weeks, and who was nevertheless whole in a way Julian recognized as different, as something he had seen in the mirror but hadn't found in his own reflection. Julian's eyes became bright. He turned his face away because he didn't want Leo to see, but it was too late. Leo didn't say anything. He sat beside him with the letter in his hand and waited. And then Julian cried. It wasn't a performative cry, it wasn't the cry of the bakery tantrums or the car door slams. It was a cry that came from a different place, deeper, the cry of someone who finally found the thread of something they were pulling without knowing what was on the other side. And on the other side was the awareness of who he was and who he could have been, and how those two paths were much further apart than he had realized before. Leo sat quietly beside him. Then, without ceremony, he leaned his shoulder against Julian's shoulder, the simple way children sometimes have of offering what they have without needing to name the gesture. In the apartment upstairs, Sarah was standing at the window when she saw the two boys sitting on the green wooden bench under the maple tree. She couldn't hear anything from the distance where she was, but she could see. And what she saw was enough for her to need to sit down, and for Mrs. Miller beside her to say in a low voice, "I think everything is going to be okay." Sarah nodded. There was a pressure behind her eyes that she this time didn't try to hold back, and the tears flowed with the calm of someone who finally allowed them to arrive, without haste, without drama, with the simple dignity of things that arrive when they are ready. The week following the Saturday on the Lower East Side was different from all the previous weeks of that period. Different in a way that wasn't loud, but was perceptible to those who paid attention to the small things. Julian woke up on Monday without needing to be called twice. He ate breakfast without commenting on what was or wasn't in the fridge. He went down to the car with the backpack on his back without dragging his feet and without making remarks about the vehicle's model. Sarah observed him during that morning with the care of someone who doesn't want to startle something fragile trying to take hold, and said nothing more than was necessary. Mark had noticed too. On Tuesday night after dinner, he had asked Sarah quietly in the hallway if something had happened that he didn't know about, and she had said yes, but that she would tell him calmly when there was time. He had nodded with the expression of someone who trusts and can wait. There was also that other story Sarah had been carrying alone since the conversation with Mrs. Miller, which weighed in a different way than the other things. She had stayed awake for much of Saturday night, thinking about what was responsible to do with what she knew. She hadn't given the name out loud in the conversation with Mrs. Miller, and Mrs. Miller also hadn't confirmed with words, but there was an understanding between the two that existed with all the clarity of something said, even if the words hadn't been pronounced. The question was simple, and at the same time impossible. Robert Sterling, the man whose work sustained Mark's position in the company, whose name was on the plaque of every building Sterling Developments had built, was the father of that boy who had returned the backpack. And Mark didn't know anything about it, and Julian, who had discarded the backpack as trash, had discarded along with it the son of the most important man in his father's entire professional chain. On Wednesday morning, after taking Julian to school, Sarah returned to the apartment and asked Mark to postpone the first meeting of the day, that they needed to talk. Mark arrived in the living room with his tie already done, and an expression of attention she had learned to value over the years. The expression of a man who, when he needed to listen, listened for real. She told him everything: the investment, the backpack, the money, Leo, Mrs. Miller, the research she had done, the conversation in the Lower East Side apartment, the silent confirmation that had occurred between the two women. She told it without abbreviation and without exaggeration, in the sequence of events as they had happened. Mark listened to her. When she finished, he was silent for a time that was longer than normal. Then he said, "Are you sure?" "I'm not absolutely sure of everything," she said, "but I have enough evidence that someone with more access could confirm, and I think that person needs to know what happened." Mark sat looking at the window. Outside was the same New York as always. The buildings, the traffic, the sky of that diluted blue that pollution turned the color of milk. He said, "If I take this to Robert and I'm wrong, the consequences for my position in the company could be serious." "I know," said Sarah, "but if you don't take it and he finds out later that you knew and didn't say anything, the consequences could be even greater." Mark was quiet a while longer. Then he said, "Give me until the end of the week." That same day, on the Lower East Side, Julian had asked Sarah to take him to Leo's neighborhood. He hadn't given an elaborate explanation. He had just said he wanted to go, and there was a quiet determination in his voice that was new enough for her not to ask more than necessary. They went by subway. Julian didn't complain. They arrived at Mrs. Russo's grocery store in the late afternoon. Leo was helping close the stock boxes for the day when the two entered, and turned with that expression of someone who wasn't expecting but also didn't find it strange. Julian stood at the entrance for a moment, hands in his pockets, then went to Leo and stood in front of him. "I want to apologize to you," said Julian, "for what the backpack was, for what I did with it. I didn't know what was inside, but I don't know if that changes anything." Leo looked at him with those quiet eyes that were of people older than their age. He was silent for a second. Then he said, "It does change things, because you're here." The two sat looking at each other for a moment, and then Julian held out his hand. Leo shook it with the firmness of someone shaking a hand and wanting the gesture to mean something. Mrs. Russo, who had watched all of this from behind the counter without making any comment, took a sip of water and returned to the register with an expression that was both discreet and satisfied, the expression of someone who saw a good thing happen and doesn't need anyone to comment to know the value of what she just witnessed. On Thursday, Mark asked for a meeting with Robert Sterling outside the office, which was unusual enough that the entrepreneur asked over the phone if it was something urgent. Mark said it was something personal he needed to share as a matter of loyalty, and Robert, who had learned over decades to distinguish those who came with self-interest from those who came with honest intention, said they would meet for lunch. The lunch lasted nearly 2 hours. Sarah didn't know the details of what had been said, because Mark, when he returned, was quiet in a way different from his usual quiet, a quiet of someone who had just had a conversation that was too important to be summarized immediately. He said only that Robert had heard everything, and that he had been silent for a long time before saying anything. and that what he had said, when he finally spoke, had been, "I needed someone to tell me this." The following Saturday, Robert Sterling went to the Lower East Side. There was no prior warning, no ceremony, no artificial construction of a dramatic revelation. There was a man with dark hair with the first signs of receding, tall, with his tie loosened and jacket on his arm, getting out of a discreet car on a street on the Lower East Side and walking to a 4-story building with a tile facade that had turned grey with the years. Leo was in the park when he saw him turn the corner. He stood with both feet on the ground, as if the weight of the air had suddenly doubled, and said nothing. Just sat looking at that man walking toward him, with steps that were controlled but carried within them a hurry that control couldn't completely hide. Robert stopped a few yards from his son. The two sat looking at each other under the maple tree by the green bench, in the same place where Leo had read the letter in a low voice to Julian days before, and there was between the two of them a silence that was so full of things that the air around seemed denser. "Son," said Robert. The voice came out with a break he hadn't been able to prevent and hadn't tried to hide. Leo went to him, and the most powerful man in the city bent his knees and hugged his 11-year-old son there in the Lower East Side Park, under the maple tree, with all of New York happening around without knowing a thing, and stayed hugging him for a time neither of them counted, because counting time was the last thing that mattered at that moment. Sarah was at the window of Mrs. Miller's apartment when that happened, and Mrs. Miller was beside her with her hands clasped over her chest, and the two women sat watching in silence the park below, with the shared certainty that there were things that took the time they needed to take, and that when they arrived whole. Julian was in the apartment too, sitting in a chair near the window, and when he saw the scene in the park, he was quiet for a while with his elbows on his knees and chin in hand. Then he looked at Sarah and said, with a voice that was different from all the voices she had heard come out of that boy in the 12 years she had spent listening, "Mom, did you know about all of this?" She went to him, sat beside him, kept her hand on his shoulder. "I found out bit by bit." Julian sat looking at the park, at the man hugging the boy under the maple tree, at the scene that had been built by a chain of events that had started with an old backpack being thrown aside without the contents being checked. "Mom," he said once more with that new quiet voice, "I was so wrong." Sarah didn't say he hadn't been wrong, because he had, and they both knew it. She didn't say everything was okay, because not everything was, and correcting it would take time. She said only, "I know, and now you know too, and that changes everything." The days following that Saturday were the beginning of something no one had planned, but that had arrived with the logic of things that need to happen. Robert Sterling and Leo began to meet regularly, with the gradually built naturalness of two people learning to be father and son after an interval that had been necessary, but had cost both more than either would admit out loud. Mrs. Miller and Robert talked like two adults carrying a common story, and knowing that this story no longer needed a secret to be respected. Mark had a conversation with Robert that was different from the work meetings of all those years, a man-to-man conversation that strengthened a trust between them that had existed professionally, but now had another, more personal layer, built on Mark's decision to be loyal even when loyalty involved risk. And Julian and Leo began to meet every week, sometimes on the Upper East Side, sometimes on the Lower East Side, sometimes in the park under the maple tree, where the two sat on the green wooden bench and talked with that frankness that only exists between people who have been honest with each other from the beginning, even when honesty was difficult. Julian learned to do deliveries with Leo on a Saturday in July. He woke up early, put on simple clothes, and walked with his friend through the streets of the neighborhood, carrying bags for people who said thank you by name and who received what had been promised at the scheduled time. At the end of that Saturday, sitting in the small diner with the passion fruit juice without sugar he had adopted as his own too, he told Leo that he had liked it, that there was something in knowing he had done something that made sense at the end of the day. Leo looked at him with those quiet eyes and said, "I knew you'd understand." And the backpack, the old grey canvas backpack that had started all of it, was kept by Sarah in the bedroom closet, as one keeps something that has no aesthetic value but has real value. The value of things that are the beginning of stories that matter. The kind of story that when it ends doesn't really end, but only changes form and continues in everything that was transformed by it. Dear listeners, if the story of Leo and Julian touched your heart, know that it was made for that, to remind us that the value of things is not on the surface they present, but in what they carry inside. Just as the old backpack the world would discard without a second thought, kept inside itself much more than it appeared. Every person around us carries stories, dignity, and riches we only see when we stop judging by appearance and start truly looking. If this story made you stop and think, then it fulfilled its mission. Share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that arrive every week with the same truth as this one, that life is generous to those who know how to see what is inside things. Leave your comment telling which part of this story stayed with you the most. And if you cried, don't be ashamed. Crying for something real is the sign that the heart is still open. We'll meet in the next story. The end.